Nurse saves abandoned baby in park. Years later, she receives heartbreaking news. On a night like any other, Rachel hears a cry that leads her to an unexpected discovery. A baby abandoned in a park. What begins as an act of compassion quickly turns into an intense fight for love and survival. Amid difficult decisions and disturbing revelations, Rachel finds herself at the center of an emotional storm, where every choice can change everything. Who is this baby, and what does the future hold for them? It was one of those nights in Denver that makes the skin prickle and the mind wander, searching for anything but the present. Rachel was walking through Washington Park, her legs heavy as if the very ground was trying to hold her back. The wind cut like tiny blades, each gust stealing a bit of her strength, already drained by her shift at the hospital. The park, which during the day was a refuge, now seemed like a place where even the shadows feared to tread. The silence that usually offered comfort now became a burden. It was as if something was wrong, but Rachel couldn't pinpoint what it was. Perhaps it was the fatigue, or maybe it was the thoughts that kept invading her mind. Either way, she needed that moment of peace, even though the park at night was not the most inviting place. Then, a sound broke the silence. A cry, faint, almost muffled by the wind. Rachel stopped, her heart racing. She looked around, trying to figure out if it was real or just her mind playing tricks on her. The sound came again, this time stronger, more insistent. Without thinking, Rachel followed the sound, her nursing instincts taking over. Each step took her deeper into the darkness, and the trees, which during the day were just trees, now seemed like sentinels, witnesses to something terrible. And then she saw it. A baby, so small, so fragile, wrapped in a dirty blanket. The cry was clearer now, and Rachel felt the weight of her responsibility grow exponentially. Who would do this? Who would leave a baby like this, at the mercy of the night, the cold, the darkness? Her trembling hands wrapped around the baby, feeling the cold emanating from his skin. The boy seemed on the brink of the limit, as if the world was about to steal his life away. Rachel's eyes scanned the park, looking for any sign of who had left the child there. But there was only emptiness, an absence that echoed the abandonment the baby was suffering. She knew she had to act quickly. Clutching the baby to her chest, she started running towards the hospital, each step now guided by the urgency to save that life. As she ran, she whispered words of comfort, even though she herself wasn't sure that everything would be okay. At the hospital, the doctors acted quickly, and Rachel couldn't step away, her eyes fixed on the baby as he was treated. Malnutrition, hypothermia, but with the right care, he would be fine. Rachel felt a wave of relief, but also something more. A new responsibility, terrifying but undeniable. She had found that baby for a reason, and she knew with painful clarity that her life was about to change forever. The cold, white walls of the hospital seemed more oppressive than ever. Rachel couldn't shake the sound of the baby's cry, echoing in her mind like a stubborn memory. The image of that small being, fighting for life, was etched into her memory, and she knew something inside her was changing. It wasn't just compassion. It was something deeper, a feeling that this baby needed her, and perhaps she needed him. The baby, now in an incubator, seemed even more vulnerable under the cold, artificial light of the hospital. Rachel watched him, her heart tight. Each of his breaths seemed like a battle, and Rachel felt powerless, trapped in a storm of emotions she could barely name. The doctor spoke about the baby's condition, but his words were just a distant hum. All that mattered was the baby, that little being who had been left to die, but was now there, fighting, and Rachel felt she needed to fight for him too. Rachel didn't go home that night. She stayed at the hospital by the incubator, watching every movement of the baby. The love growing inside her was unexpected but undeniable. She had seen so many lives begin and end within those walls, but nothing had touched her soul like that little boy. His abandonment revolted her, but at the same time it motivated her. She knew that if it were possible, She would do everything to ensure he had a chance. In the days that followed, Rachel continued to work, but her mind was always with the baby. She called him Lucas, a name that came to her mind as if it were already destined for him. The idea of returning to her empty apartment became unbearable. The silence, which was once a relief, now felt like torture. Lucas filled her thoughts, her nights, her days, and the idea of adopting him began to take root in her heart. When she finally decided to talk to Michael about the possibility of adoption, Rachel knew it would be difficult. Michael had always been practical, someone who valued stability above all. For him, bringing a child, especially one with such an uncertain past, would be a huge change. The conversation took place on a cold night, similar to the one when Rachel found Lucas. She was nervous, and Michael noticed immediately. "Rachel, this is crazy," he said, trying to stay calm. "We weren't planning this. Bringing a child into our lives will change everything." Rachel knew he was right, but she couldn't ignore what she felt. "I know, Michael, but I can't just turn my back on him. I found him, and I feel like he needs me." Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand what you're feeling, but this isn't something simple. Adopting a child, especially like this, will completely change our lives." Silence settled between them, heavy. Rachel knew she was asking a lot, but for her, the decision was already made, even if it hadn't been expressed in words yet. "Michael, I know it's not easy, but I can't abandon Lucas. He needs someone, and I feel like I'm that person." Michael looked at her for a long time, the sadness in his eyes almost palpable. "Rachel, I don't know if I can do this. I need time to think." Rachel nodded, but she knew those words carried a weight that might be unbearable. The hours dragged on, turning days into an endless sequence of silences and avoided glances. Rachel's apartment, which had once been a refuge, now felt like a cold place, mirroring the growing distance between her and Michael. The silence between them was like a living presence, an invisible barrier that turned every attempt at conversation into a trap. It was as if something had broken, something that perhaps couldn't be repaired. At the hospital, things began to fall apart as well. What had once been seen as compassion from Rachel was now viewed with suspicion. Her colleagues, who had once admired her, now looked at her with a mix of concern and criticism. Words of support turned into whispers in the corridors, questioning whether Rachel was letting her emotions interfere with her work. And it hurt her deeply, more than she was willing to admit. One afternoon, while reviewing Lucas records, Helen, an older nurse and her mentor, approached Rachel. Helen had always been frank, and Rachel knew the conversation that would follow wouldn't be easy. "Rachel, you're getting too involved. This isn't healthy, neither for you nor for the baby," Helen said, her voice firm but with a gentleness that only experience brings. Rachel tried to stay calm, but the knot in her stomach wouldn't let her. "Helen, I know it seems impulsive, but I feel like I'm doing the right thing. Lucas has no one." Helen sighed, her expression softening a bit. "I understand your compassion, but you need to think about the impact this could have on your life, on your career. We can't save everyone, Rachel, and if you keep going like this, you might end up losing yourself in the process." Those words echoed in Rachel's mind long after Helen had walked away. She knew Helen was right in many ways, but at the same time, her heart couldn't be ignored. The connection with Lucas was something she couldn't explain, but she knew it was real and important. However, doubts began to creep in, eroding her confidence, making her question if she was really prepared for the consequences of her choice. And then, finally, the conversation she dreaded with Michael happened. Sitting on the couch, the silence between them was almost unbearable, a constant and suffocating presence. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable sadness in his words. "Rachel, I've thought a lot about what you said," he began, unable to look directly at her. "And I need to be honest. I can't do this. I can't accept the idea of bringing this baby into our lives." The words fell like stones on Rachel, each one heavier than the last. She had already known this was his answer, but hearing it out loud made everything more real, more definitive. "Michael, I understand your fears, but I can't abandon Lucas. He needs me." Michael finally looked at her, and what she saw in his eyes almost made her crumble. "Rachel, I know you feel that way, but I can't. I need stability, a life I can plan. And this isn't something I can accept." The silence that followed was devastating. Rachel felt as if the ground was disappearing under her feet. Everything she had built with Michael was disintegrating. When he stood up and started packing his things, Rachel couldn't stop him. There were no screams, no fights, just the painful acceptance that they were on different paths. Michael left that night, taking with him the hopes of a future that Rachel had dreamed of. And she was left alone, in the silence of the night, with a decision that now seemed clearer than ever. Lucas was her future, and she was willing to sacrifice everything for him. Michael's departure left Rachel disoriented, as if everything she knew was being taken from her hands. The loneliness in her apartment, which had once been a refuge, now became an overwhelming presence, a constant reminder of what she had lost. But amid the emotional chaos, a certainty began to emerge. She wouldn't give up on Lucas. He was now the only thing that made sense, the only thing worth fighting for. With Michael out of the picture, Rachel threw herself entirely into Lucas's life. Every smile of his, every little progress, was like a ray of light amid the darkness. She spent more and more time at the hospital, caring for Lucas, talking to him, promising that everything would be okay, even though deep down, she wasn't sure of it herself. Every day, the bond between them grew stronger, and Rachel knew there was no turning back. But the dark clouds continued to gather around her. At the hospital, the support Rachel had received began to evaporate. The nurses who once understood her now looked at her with something bordering on disapproval. The pressure began to mount, and Dr. Whitaker, the hospital director, didn't take long to call Rachel in for a conversation she knew wouldn't be easy. "Rachel, we need to talk about your situation with the baby," Dr. Whitaker began, his voice controlled and cold. "I understand that you feel attached to him, but I must remind you that you are a professional, and professionals can't be driven by emotions." Rachel felt a knot forming in her chest, but she kept her gaze steady. "Dr. Whitaker, I know my actions may seem impulsive, but I'm doing what I believe is right. This baby was abandoned. He has no one." The director raised his hand, interrupting her. "I understand, Rachel, but you need to consider the impact this could have on your career. Your colleagues are concerned. We can't let this personal involvement compromise the professional environment." She felt the words like a blow, but she wouldn't back down. "Dr. Whitaker, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to ensure my performance at the hospital isn't compromised. But at the same time, I can't simply ignore Lucas's situation. He needs someone to love him, to take care of him, and I'm willing to be that person." Dr. Whitaker stared at her for a long moment before letting out a heavy sigh. "Rachel, you're one of the best nurses we have. I don't want to see you ruin your career because of a rash decision. Think carefully. Adopting a child, especially one with an uncertain past, is an enormous responsibility. It's not something you should decide on impulsively." Rachel wanted to argue, wanted to make him understand what she felt, but the words failed. She knew he was right in many ways, but her heart couldn't be ignored. The meeting ended with a veiled warning, and Rachel left the office feeling crushed by the pressure, but also with a growing determination. When she returned home that night, the loneliness of her apartment enveloped her like a cold blanket. The silence was deafening, and Michael's absence was a constant reminder of the choices she had made. But at the same time, Rachel knew she had made the right decision. Lucas needed her, and she was willing to face anything for him. The next day, Rachel began the adoption process. The decision was final, and she was prepared to fight for Lucas, even if it meant sacrificing her career, her relationship, and even her peace of mind. She was alone, but she didn't feel alone. Every smile from Lucas, every little gesture, reinforced her determination. But the universe seemed to have other plans. A few weeks later, when Rachel thought things were beginning to stabilize, a new storm approached. One morning, upon arriving at the hospital, she was called again to Dr. Whitaker's office. The tone in his voice over the phone was cold, impersonal, different from any previous conversation. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine as she walked through the corridors, her heart beating faster with each step. When she entered the office, Dr. Whitaker was accompanied by 2 other members of the hospital administration. The atmosphere in the room was dense, charged with a tension that Rachel could almost touch. She felt a weight in her stomach as she sat down, her eyes fixed on the stern faces staring back at her. "Rachel, we've received a complaint," Dr. Whitaker began without preamble. "A patient claims you didn't give due attention to her case, which resulted in a complication that could have been avoided. The administration has decided to investigate, and until the investigation is complete, you'll be suspended from your duties." The words fell like a lightning bolt. Rachel felt the blood freeze in her veins, and a wave of despair threatened to engulf her. She wanted to protest, wanted to scream that it was a mistake, that she would never have neglected any patient. But the words were stuck in her throat. All she could think about was Lucas and what this suspension would mean for them. Dr. Whitaker continued, his voice distant, almost indifferent. "This isn't a decision we've taken lightly, Rachel, but we must ensure that all patients receive proper care. While the investigation is ongoing, you won't be able to perform your duties here." Rachel left the office feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her career was at risk, her life had been turned upside down, and all because of a decision that, though made with the heart, now seemed to be exacting too high a price. The days following Rachel's suspension were a spiral of despair and uncertainty. Each morning, upon waking, she felt the crushing weight of doubt, guilt, and fear. Without her job, life seemed like an endless cycle of worries, each one more overwhelming than the last. The only thing that still gave her strength was Lucas, but even that strength began to wear down under the weight of growing responsibilities and accumulating fears. The apartment, once a place of rest and refuge, had become a prison where the echoes of her own anguish resounded endlessly. The walls seemed to close in on her, as if they were about to collapse and bury her under the weight of her choices and consequences. What had once been a sanctuary was now an oppressive space, where every object, every corner, reminded her of the battles she was losing. The visits to the hospital, which had been her only source of hope, became more difficult. The distance and cost of travel, combined with the guilt of not being able to be more present in Lucas's life, were overwhelming. Every time she saw the boy, she felt a mix of joy and sadness, as if she were failing to be the mother he deserved. Little Lucas, with his bright eyes and innocent smile, was the only ray of light amid the darkness surrounding her. But even that light began to dim under the shadow of despair. It was on one of those nights, as Rachel sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and documents she could no longer organize, that something unexpected happened. A soft knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. At first, she ignored it, thinking her tired mind was playing tricks on her. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. Rachel finally got up, her body heavy with emotional exhaustion, and went to answer. When she opened the door, she found John, her neighbor from the floor below. John, a man of few words, had always been a quiet presence in the building. They had exchanged few conversations over the months, but never beyond casual greetings. However, that night he seemed different. There was a seriousness in his eyes, a weight he carried along with an unexpected empathy. "Rachel," he began, his voice calm but loaded with genuine concern. "I heard about what you're going through. I know we're not exactly close, but if you need help of any kind, I'm here." Rachel felt a lump in her throat. John's words were like a lifeline in the midst of the wreck. She didn't know what to say, surprised by this offer of support from an almost stranger. "Thank you, John," she murmured, her voice trembling, laden with repressed emotion. I don't know what to do. Everything is falling apart, and I'm afraid I won't be able to take care of Lucas." John nodded slowly, his expression understanding. "I can't imagine what you're going through, but no one should carry this weight alone. Sometimes the load is too heavy, and having someone to share it with makes all the difference." From that night on, the relationship between Rachel and John began to change. He started showing up more frequently, offering his help in ways Rachel didn't know she needed. He took care of the small tasks she could no longer handle, like tidying up the apartment, shopping, or even taking care of Lucas for a few hours so she could get some rest. But most importantly, he was there to listen. And Rachel, who had always prided herself on being strong, on handling everything on her own, finally allowed someone to help her. Lucas, who had once seemed restless and anxious, began to relax in John's presence. It was as if John's tranquility spread through the environment, bringing a bit of peace to a situation that seemed unsustainable. Rachel saw how Lucas reacted to John's presence, how he smiled and calmed down with him nearby, and it made her realize that, for the first time in a long time, she was no longer alone. Still, the practical problems continued to pile up. The process of adopting Lucas was at risk. Without Rachel's salary, the bills piled up, each one more urgent than the last. The investigation at the hospital continued with no signs of resolution, and Rachel knew that even if everything was cleared up in her favor, her career had already been stained. The criticisms, the disapproving looks from her colleagues, all of it was slowly eroding her confidence. It was then that Rachel received an unexpected call. The phone rang late in the afternoon, interrupting a rare moment of calm. It was Lucas's teacher, from the daycare he had recently started attending. The teacher's tone of voice was warm and welcoming, but it also carried a seriousness that made Rachel brace herself for the worst. "Rachel," he began, "I know you're going through a difficult time, but I need to talk about Lucas. He's a special child, very loved here. There's something about him, a light, that touches everyone around him. I know you're the reason for that. I want you to know that if you need help, I and others here are ready to support you." Rachel felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, there was the relief of knowing that Lucas was well, that he was loved and cared for. On the other hand, there was the pain of knowing that she wasn't being able to do everything on her own, that she needed help. But at that moment, something inside her began to change. Maybe it was the fact that, finally, someone outside the hospital recognized her struggle, saw the sacrifice she was willing to make for Lucas. Or maybe it was simply the warm voice of the teacher, offering support without judgment, without expectations. With the help of the teacher and John, Rachel began to rebuild her life, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and the challenges were still immense, but now she was no longer alone. Their support brought a new perspective, new possibilities for facing difficulties. Gradually, Rachel began to find strengths she didn't know she had. She continued to fight for Lucas's adoption, faced the investigation at the hospital with her head held high, and despite the difficulties, she persisted. It was during this period of transformation that Rachel realized something important. She wasn't just fighting for Lucas. She was fighting for herself, for her own dignity, for her ability to love and protect, even when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. With each passing day, Rachel felt her determination grow, driven by the love she felt for Lucas and the unwavering support of John. And then, when everything seemed to be finally falling into place, Rachel received news that would change the course of her life once again. It was an ordinary afternoon, and the phone rang. The voice of the social services officer was familiar, but what he said made the ground disappear beneath her feet. "Rachel, "We found Lucas's biological mother," said the officer, his voice professional but with a tone of gravity that didn't go unnoticed. "And there's something you need to know." Rachel felt the world spin, the officer's words echoing in her mind. The revelation about Lucas's biological mother was the last blow in a series of challenges that had already tested all her limits. But at the same time, it was also the beginning of something new. An opportunity for Rachel to confront not only Lucas's past ghosts, but also her own. Rachel knew that no matter what came next, she was no longer alone. She had John, she had Lucas, and she had herself stronger and more determined than ever. The transformation was complete. She had gone through the fire and, though marked, had emerged stronger, more resilient. She was ready to face whatever came next. The phone slipped from Rachel's hands, falling to the floor with a muffled sound, but she barely noticed. Everything around her seemed distant, as if the world had lost focus. The social services officer's words echoed in her mind, repeating in an endless loop. Lucas's biological mother has been found. She had imagined so many times who Lucas's mother could be, but never like this. Never a woman so desperate that she was forced to make such a painful decision. Sitting on the floor, Rachel wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to find some kind of anchor in the midst of the storm now raging inside her. The idea that Lucas's mother abandoned him not out of lack of love, but out of fear that he would become a victim of the same violence she faced, was a blow Rachel hadn't expected. She looked at Lucas, still playing innocently on the floor, unaware of the turmoil his adoptive mother was facing. A wave of emotions washed over Rachel. Sadness, compassion, anger, guilt. Sadness for the pain Lucas's biological mother must have felt when she left him in that park. Compassion for a woman who did what she believed was the only thing that could save her son. Anger at the whole situation, at the injustice of a world that forces a mother to separate from her child out of fear and violence. And guilt for feeling relieved that Lucas was now under her care, safe and loved, while his biological mother still faced the shadows of her past. Rachel knew she had to make a decision. She still wanted to adopt Lucas, but now that choice seemed more complex, more weighty. Adopting Lucas meant not only committing to love and protect him, but also carrying the story of his biological mother, honoring the sacrifice she made. The pain of that woman was now part of Lucas's story, and Rachel knew she would have to deal with it carefully, respectfully. As these emotions consumed her, Rachel felt John's presence. He had entered the room without her noticing, his steps silent, but his presence comforting. He knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice full of concern. "What happened?" The words finally came out, and Rachel told John everything the officer had said. John listened in silence, his eyes never leaving hers, offering the support she so desperately needed. When she finished, the silence stretched between them, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was full of understanding, of support. "Rachel," John began, choosing his words carefully, "I know this is a lot to process, and I know you feel overwhelmed by this responsibility. But you're not alone in this. We're in this together. Lucas is our son, and we'll do whatever it takes to ensure he has the best life possible." John's words brought an unexpected calm to Rachel. For the first time since receiving the news, she felt that she didn't have to carry this burden alone. John was with her, and that made all the difference. Together, they could face whatever lay ahead. In the days that followed, Rachel immersed herself in the story of Lucas's biological mother. She wanted to better understand the woman who, amid so much fear and despair, made a decision that changed everyone's lives. With the help of the social services officer, Rachel obtained more information about her. Her name was Emily. She had fled her abuser and was trying to rebuild her life in another state, but the trauma of what she had gone through still haunted her. Rachel was surprised to realize that Emily wasn't so different from her. An ordinary woman, facing extraordinary circumstances. There was a photo attached to the social services officer's report, a photo of Emily holding Lucas when he was still a newborn. Emily's look in the photo was of pure love and at the same time, despair. Rachel spent hours looking at that image, trying to imagine what Emily must have felt at that moment. And finally, Rachel understood. She wasn't just Lucas's adoptive mother, but also the guardian of his story, his past, and the legacy of love and sacrifice that Emily had left behind. With this understanding, Rachel made a decision. She would write a letter to Emily. Not a formal letter, but something personal, something that expressed what she was feeling. She wanted Emily to know that Lucas was safe, that he was loved, and that she, Rachel, would never allow him to forget who his biological mother was. The letter was written with care, each word weighing on her heart. When she finished, Rachel felt that something inside her had changed. It was as if she had finally found a way to honor Emily and at the same time, move forward. The adoption process continued, and soon Rachel and John received the news that everything was finalized. Lucas was officially theirs. The joy of that moment was shared with tears, laughter, and the certainty that, despite all the difficulties, they had made the right choice. Lucas now had a family, a mother, a father, and soon a sister. Rachel's pregnancy brought a new light into her life. Every movement of Anna in her womb was a reminder that, despite everything, life continued, flourished. John was by her side every step of the way, his unwavering support and love growing each day. And Lucas, now with a mother and father, was also flourishing. He was a happy child, his laughter filling Rachel's home with a joy she had never imagined possible. When Anna was born, Rachel felt that she had finally completed the circle. Her 2 children were there, by her side, and the sense of peace she felt as she held them in her arms was indescribable. The weight of the adversities she had faced seemed distant now, like a storm that had passed, leaving the sun to shine again. But Rachel never forgot Emily. On Lucas's birthday, she sat down with him and began to tell the story of his biological mother. She spoke to him about the love Emily had for him, about the sacrifice she made to ensure he had a chance to live a safe life. And as she spoke, Rachel felt that she was fulfilling her promise. She was honoring Emily, ensuring that Lucas knew where he came from and how much he had been loved from the beginning. Watching Lucas and Anna play together in the park, Rachel knew that despite all the challenges, she had found her happiness. She had built a family based on love, courage, and strength. And as the sun set, illuminating the faces of her children, Rachel felt that she was finally where she was meant to be.